Welcome to the Cyber Savvy Boardroom. Thanks for joining us today. Your hosts are myself, David Himovich, and Alicia Cade, both within Google Cloud's Office of the CISO. You can find and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. So Alicia, today we're joined by Mark Lobel. Mark has over 40 years of experience. He's held multiple leadership roles in cybersecurity, including at PwC. But Mark also has run 3 marathons so far. He's achieved his NACD Director certification, advised multiple AI startups, and acted as a capstone mentor for the NYU Cyber Law Master's Program. He also has assisted as an executive coach for CISOs and CEOs on board communications.
May I add to that from a personal perspective? Because Mark and I have worked together at PwC, and I knew Mark as people leader and cyber practice leader in our New York practice. And I tell you, I just know that we will get really valuable insights from Mark for board members and CISOs alike, because he's always gone very, very far to understand the total customer context and always put himself in their shoes, whether they were the boards or the CISOs. So buckle up. It will be really practical and it will be 360 degrees.
Let's get to the episode. So Mark, welcome to the Cyber Savvy Boardroom. We talked about your background in the intro, but one very important point that we left out is that you also are a former DJ. So you know all about finding the perfect mix. And let's apply that to the boardroom and cue up a concept that you raised in a recent panel discussion that I saw, which was this idea of board members being head in and hands out when it comes to cybersecurity. We often hear from newer board members asking, how much do I really need to ensure risk is managed in line with the risk appetite? So how do you define that line between necessary oversight and getting too deep into the operational weeds for boards?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. Absolute pleasure. And to answer your question directly, the line can be fuzzy. So there's no clear one point that says exactly the board stops here. But when the board is overriding operational decisions of management, I think that's where you can say the line is behind you. You look in the rearview mirror and say, we've gone too far. You've got to make those decisions about what feedback you're giving management and whether management takes it or not. If you're overriding management's decisions, well, then you're not deciding on what the right management for the organization. You are managing the organization. And at least the way the board theory rolls out of that head in, but hands out, you've stepped over the line.
Mark, let's take it a bit further beyond that line. So whilst head in and hands out is the goal, what are the triggers and the specific red flags that tell you that it's time to shake it all about? Sorry, I can't resist. And break that rule and get involved. And I must say, one real world scenario comes to my mind. And there's been a lot of discussion among CISOs that I've been part of as to whether the board should participate in cyber simulation exercises, because that might not be commensurate with their roles. I know very well which side of the fence I'm sitting on. But why do some advisors push back on this? Where do you stand? And where does it take us in this emergency, exceptional circumstances with actually keeping your hands in for the board? It's very, very appropriate.
Absolutely. So there's 2 questions kind of baked in there. The first one is, what is that red flag? And a crisis is usually the red flag. If the responsible executive, in this case, the CISO, or if a CFO or the CEO becomes unavailable due to, let's just say, an illness. If there is a board member who has the requisite skills, knowledge, and experience to step in the role, and you see this happen all the time with CFOs and CEOs, where a prior CEO joins the board when a new CEO comes in, if something happens to the current CEO, the old CEO will step in. They will retake the role of CEO. Now they'll have to step out of their board role because you can't oversee something and operate it at the same time effectively. But when a crisis occurs, if the individual on the board has the requisite experience, they can step into the role for a period of time until a new leader can be brought in to take that, in this case, the CISO position. And then to your point of cyber simulation exercises and should the board, I can see maybe a scenario where the board wouldn't be involved, but the vast majority of times, if it's me, and I've done a ton of tabletop exercises over the decades, I want the board there and I want them involved. Two major reasons. Number one, it's great education for the board. Number two, it helps the board understand their role and their lane. And I'll just share a story of one of the tabletops I did years ago. Beautiful incident response plan, huge thick binder right in the middle of the table. Everybody's sitting around the table. We laid out the scenario. We said go. And everybody started to figure out who should do what, where, even though step-by-step directions were in a binder in the center of the table, right in front of them, literally arm's reach. They could have just gone there. But no, they started figuring it out and, of course, figured it out not consistent with the plan and had issue after issue. And when we did the lessons learned afterwards, it was just a list of things that they'd worked out in advance in the plan that they didn't execute because they were making it up on the fly. I think without practicing and without knowing your role, board, as well as the other business unit leaders and the C-level executives, will go sideways, not because they're not good people, not because they're not experienced, because they haven't practiced what their lanes are in a crisis.
I must say, I'm in the same club as you are. Yes, for cyber simulations with the board. And that takes me actually to another angle and talking about the skills. It takes a village of skills to make sure that the risks, operational risks, are managed appropriately, including cyber risk. But we know also that relying on a single cyber expert in the boardroom is a somewhat outdated and risky model as well. And it's viewed increasingly as a perhaps governance liability. So since again, cyber risk is just as any operational risk, it requires critical thinking from everybody because it has implications financially, legally, reputationally as well. How can the board ensure continuous education? And what does it take to elevate that baseline of fluency of the whole boardroom?
So the phrase I think of, individual expertise is the starting point, but collective literacy of the board is the goal. Boards are purposely diverse, so you get a whole set of different thinking and the ability to debate all sides of an issue and decide it in the most intelligent and effective manner. And when the CISO says something to the board, the cyber expert on the board nods. Everybody else on the board says, oh, the cyber expert on the board nodded, so I'm going to disengage. You're not getting the diversity of the thought. You're not getting that diversity of experience that a board should be bringing to every conversation, not just cyber, but specifically around cyber. And there are some boards that have worked on their literacy. There are many that have not. I think it's definitely an area for improvement. And how can you improve? Well, the packages that boards get, those services have cyber training. Universities have board-level cyber training. There are tons of different classes and tools that bring cyber to the right level for board members to perform oversight. They don't need to know the technical details at any specific level, but they need to know enough to be able to give appropriate oversight and for everyone on the board to have collective basic literacy to understand the decisions that they're making on behalf of the organization.
Another thumbs up for cyber simulation.
Yes, absolutely.
And for boards to think a little bit as well about their own digital footprint out there and how they are high value assets and potentially being targeted by nefarious actors as well. I think it's a great best practice for boards to think about how can I be protecting myself, my own data, my own information that's out there.
Yes, and there are services that actually help with that, which I think, depending on the board, depending on the organization, especially the high-profile ones, you want to bring on one of those services or one of those organizations to protect not only the executives of the company, but protect the board as well.
Yep, good advice. So I remember when we would prepare for board discussions, and we would spend a ton of time beforehand thinking about what are the toughest questions the board members are going to ask us, and how can we prepare ahead of time for those. But often we would get the toughest, simplest questions from boards, right? And you can't be evasive when a board member asks you a question. So an example of that, frequently that CISOs probably get is, are we secure, right? Very, very simple question. So how can experienced board members coach their CISOs to think about how they answer that question effectively? Because CISOs don't want to sound like they're dodging the question, but they want to make sure they're getting the board the information that they need.
Well, first, what is the board member's goal asking that very simple question? If it's to get an answer and get the information, well, then yes, I think we'll come back to strategies CISOs can use. But if the goal is to test the CISO and see how they respond to a difficult to answer question under pressure, if you want to see how they react in a boardroom to get a sense of how the CISO is going to react in a crisis, well, that simple, very difficult to answer question is very, very good. Now, having said that, if the goal is to get the answer, well, CISOs, I think, have a couple of things, and the board members can coach the CISOs if it goes badly in one meeting for future meetings on how to answer. So number one, have practiced the answers to some of those difficult questions. And in fact, practiced answers to almost every question you think the board could ask. If you haven't done your homework, you're not prepared. Number two, if you're asked a yes or no question, like, are we secure? Well, you've got to give a yes or a no, then you can clarify. But if you try to talk around it and you don't directly answer the question, it's not going to go well for the CISO. And then the third thing, which you see a lot, and you see politicians do this a lot, it's reframe the question. So, are we secure? Well, are we reasonably secure? Reframe the question. Yes, for the spend that you've entrusted in us, we think we have reasonable controls. Is it perfect? No. Let's talk about what that means. And then you can answer it. And politicians do that all the time, reframing and answering the questions they wanted to be asked, not the question they actually were asked.
Yeah, it's a real art that you can see from politicians. So how can we also help board members graduate from those binary questions, though? What should they be asking instead to get a real read on the organization's resiliency?
I think it's asking questions, even if they are yes-no questions, that have layers of subtlety you can answer to them and that get to specific risk topics. So the are you secure? It's a classic yes-no question.
Yeah.
But something more like, do our cyber controls directly tie to a revenue at risk? It can be a yes-no answer, but then you can talk about how cyber controls align with specific business units, with specific revenue, and so on and so forth. So I think it's asking the better yes-no question by the board member. And like we said before, coaching the CISO to answer it as cleanly and clearly as possible.
This is a perfect way because it takes me to the context of the boardroom and CISO's reports to the board. And after those questions, are we secure and can it happen to us? We always talk about the risk and the risk mitigation. But I remember that often the CISO reports actually neglect the other side of the coin, which is the budget stewardship. And the fact that perhaps not only security teams, but also technology leaders may rarely pitch reducing the spend on legacy systems to trade off emerging priorities like new tools and AI and moving things forward rather than addressing the sands that we build the castles on. So perhaps this is actually a symptom of something much deeper that we should be addressing in the dialogue in the boardroom between the CISOs and technology leaders and the boards.
I agree. And it really comes back to you want to communicate that you're an effective steward of the spend entrusted to you by the organization. But what communication do the CISOs have with the boards? Usually, at least for many public boards, it's 15 minutes 4 times a year or sometimes twice a year. There's not enough time to get into the detail when you think of that 15 minutes, 7.5, 8, maybe presentation, and the balance will be questions and answers. There's just not enough time. So I think 2 strategies that the boards can use and the CISOs can use. Number 1, the CISOs in that presentation graphically show not only how you're protecting risk through cyber controls, but show also the things that are declining that you're an effective steward of the spend. And there are graphs and charts and ways you can communicate that effectively. But the other one, and I think the board members need to make a decision to lean in on this one, it's the communication outside of the board relationship. I think it's the CISO hosting, bringing the board into a threat intelligence session or into the threat intelligence center for understanding who the threat actors are and doing a deeper dive. And this goes back to the comment about, individual expertise on the board, but this is one of the ways, in addition to all the training we talked about, to get that collective literacy as well.
So we've spent a lot of time talking about kind of oversight, but in this head in, hands out kind of analogy we're using, it also means knowing when the organization is capable of taking a punch. And so how should board members probe the gap between a security plan and operational resiliency?
This one gets a little tricky, but I think it's coming back and understanding the metrics and what the most important decision criteria are, and realizing that operational metrics are great and important, but not every cyber risk will have a metric associated with it. And flip, not every cyber metric is necessarily valuable. Just because you can collect a metric doesn't mean that that metric is valuable. And just because you don't have a metric doesn't mean that the cyber information or cyber control isn't important to talk about. So having metrics is great, but I think going beyond it. Not every risk has a metric associated with it.
Yeah, they are a helpful guide, but not the answer always.
Yeah, great point. Yeah. Okay, Mark, so to wrap up, this is your drop the mic moment. What's one piece of actionable advice that you would give to board members today?
One word, prepare. It is too late to plan and prepare during a crisis. And that's where more value is lost. That's where bigger mistakes are made. I'll go back to the example I said before about the tabletop exercise where nobody went to the plan and things went sideways. So if there's one thing you take away from this podcast today, as a board member, start the planning now. Understand your role. Do your tabletop exercises. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Be prepared to understand who does what, who makes what decisions, when those decisions need to be made, especially around regulatory reporting of an incident to the SEC or other privacy-related bodies. Understand all those pieces, because again, when a breach occurs, it's too late to prepare. It is too late to plan. Start right now.
Very good advice. Mark, thank you very much for joining us today in the Cyber Savvy Boardroom.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.